movies for black girl nerds.
No, I'm so glad to just be sitting here with you today. I was so excited to watch the four different episodes because I'm into horror a little bit. I like to be scared sometimes, but it was very interesting just to see the concept behind some of the famous like horror figures that we know, like Dracula, like Frankenstein, stuff that I didn't even realize. So, who do you think is your favorite horror figure and why?
Oh, my favorite horror figure. Well, I got into horror in the 80s and 90s when I was growing up and in, middle school and high school and things like that. So, my definitely gravitate to the Jason Voorhees, the Freddy Krueger from A Nightmare on Elm Street, like the kind of 80s slasher,
Yeah.
those kind of movies, Chucky, and then kind of the obscure 80s horror movies like Three on a Meat Hook and Deranged, like Basket Case, like all these kind of obscure horror movies. So I totally love and admire Dracula and Frankenstein and the kind of the original American monsters, I definitely gravitate to more the 80s and 90s.
So why do you feel that people feel so connected to horror figures usually? Because I know that we took from different concepts going on historical times to create these figures, but still continuing today. And now it's kind of more make believe figures. We're kind of having more to work with. But why do you feel that we still feel so more connected to these horror films and these horror figures?
Well, I mean, that's really the underlying kind of idea of the series is that these horror movies, the horror figures, they're connected to a real world fear. And that's what makes them resonate. So when you have Frankenstein in the 1930s or Dracula, that those are really reflecting kind of that fear of the upper class establishment in the backdrop of post-war America and the stock market crash of the 1920s and all that kind of thing. And then when you look at horror movies in the 80s and 90s, they're reflecting like this idea that evil's lurking around every corner, that there's serial killers out there that we don't know about. And then when you get into more contemporary horror, they're reflecting the ideals of today, whether it be things like Me Too and Black Lives Matter and all that kind of stuff, or even the advent of the cell phone and the idea that you can be recorded at any time, and so we see that a lot in horror movies. So I think all these horror movies are resonate with people because they are tied into something in the real world, and so when people come to watch them, there's kind of this cathartic um, expression that happens. Like they come together and are scared together in a safe way in a movie theater.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I do think that you have excellent points, especially with, noting how it can make people feel better. It can have people feel like, okay, I have a safe space, I have a distraction, right? But what
Yeah.
about when those films or those different serial killer shows, do you feel that those can really influence people? Like what happens when they're like a negative thing?
Oh, well, I mean, that's an age-old debate
Yeah.
going back, since we've had television. Is the violence on television
Hmm.
causing violence in real life, or is it reflecting violence in real life? Um, you know, in our last series, Fall River, we did on epics. We really dove into that question of, is 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 evil kind of inherent in the culture, or is it being reflected by the media, kind of thing? So I don't have a good answer for you.
No, you're fine.
That's I've spent my career exploring that question. I
Yeah.
don't know.
I'm glad though you've been searching for it. You're like, no, that's a good
Yeah, I'm
thing.
looking. I'll
But
let
no,
you know
one
when I
thing
find out.
yeah. But no, one thing that I find interesting about these horror figures is that there's always one part of them, one aspect that's very sentimental that gets you. So do you feel that that's the key to creating a really iconic horror figure, like the likes of Jason or
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't, I could see it both ways. When you have Jason, Jason is appealing because he is a neglected child. Like that is, at the end of the day, that's what Jason is. He's a neglected, abused
yeah,
child who has grown into this monster because of how he was treated. But then you look at Michael Myers, and Michael Myers really what's scary about him is that he has no backstory. He is a blank. He is just evil. That's what's scary about him. So I think I don't think there's a characteristic that really like ties them all together. I think it's more that they are reflective of the time they were created. You know, like Frankenstein was really, really scary at the time because it's this like evil lumbering towards you. And that's like what life felt like at that time. Where, now, you have movies like Get Out, and that's scary for a whole different reason,
Psychological thriller. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
No, I definitely agree. Because even watching the different genres, I feel that they're all different in a sense, even though they're entirely horror. Like even with like watching Dracula, I'm like, okay, wow, like people even romanticize like vampires now because Twilight came out, so it was like a whole thing. But like Dracula, why do you feel that I feel like he was one of the first starting, people like the horror figures to be like, okay, like this is actually successful, like in the series that you were showing. But why do you feel like so many people were like drawn to him instead of afraid? You know what I mean? Because he was
Yeah,
like,
yeah. Dracula really is unique, right? Because he was the first monster that like embraced what he was. Like, when you think about Frankenstein or the Wolfman, or even, to a lesser extent, the Invisible Man, or, those kind of monsters, or King Kong or Godzilla, like all those monsters are like, they're evil in spite of their character. Like they don't set out to like, they don't love being evil. I mean Frankenstein especially is like a tragic figure, but Dracula he like loves being evil. He like goes out and he celebrates it. It's like he's reveling in how evil he is, and so there's something really fun about that. And
no,
there's
I
some
think it's very intriguing too. It's like, wow,
Yeah,
I
yeah,
love being bad. Like,
yeah. Yeah, and I think he was the first horror icon that did that. Now, I mean, now, you have Jason Voorhees and Michael Myers and all and Chucky. Like Chucky loves being evil, but Dracula really was the first person. And this is in our first episode. There's a big kind of sub. Um, I'm not sure what the word is, but there's a big kind of like idea that Dracula is sucking the kind of sexual energy out of
yes,
people, and like
yeah,
really kind of exploiting their, I think Patton Oswalt calls it their kink in the
the
show.
desires, yeah.
Yeah, their desires. So like you love it, like he's sexy and scary at the same time.
And it's serious. And people love a little mystery.
Yeah, yeah.
So just in general in today's, horror films that have been put out or like series, what is one like particular like show if you remember, or even like a film that's been put out recently that you feel really upholds like the true standards of like horror that you felt like was a very good
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. But a contemporary movie that I feel like is like, well, personally, I mean, I really love horror movies that are horror movies. Like I love movies that are like in the genre. I saw, I'm trying to think of movies horror movies I saw recently were, I mean, obviously like the Halloween trilogy from Blumhouse,
Mhm.
I think really celebrates horror and it's just really in the genre, and yet kind of like appeals to everybody. I think those are great movies. Um, there was this great Italian horror movie. I think it was called A Classic Horror Story that just came out, and it was, I mean, maybe it came out a year ago or something, but it was brilliant. I loved it.
Yeah,
you
no,
know,
and I feel that you're so creative. Like you're how you like, executive producer of this show. It was so well done, I feel.
oh,
And I'm
thank
really
you.
just, yeah, no, of course. And I'm just really intrigued to know like what is just something overall that you want fans to be able to take away from this series, or even like horror film, like lovers, anything like that.
I hope that this series is a gateway drug into horror. Like that you watch it, and if you love it, it inspires you to go and explore older titles that maybe you haven't watched in a while, and kind of dust those VHSs off the shelf. Or if you're just getting into it, I hope you watch it and really go deeper and really fall in love with horror like we love horror.
Do you think it'll answer all the questions that they have about their like favorite horror figures if they are in the series?
No, no. But it answers a lot. And there was, I mean, I learned a lot of stuff, watching the series and being, producing it and directing it, all that kind of stuff. Like I learned tons of stuff, just, from John Carpenter, John Cunningham, and all these iconic people, and Judy Greer, and you'd hear all these great anecdotes and how they love horror and how they approach things. And I thought that was brilliant. I love the idea. I mean, I'd heard this story. Here's a good one. Like John Carpenter talks about, when they went to actually make the costume for Michael Myers in the 70s, when they made the first Halloween, they just went to a costume shop and bought a William Shatner mask and spray painted it white. And that's kind of like an iconic story. I've heard that story before, but then he talked about just the idea that, like, Michael Myers, when they conceived of him, when they put him in the series, like he was just supposed to be this blank. He was supposed to be the embodiment of evil. He had no backstory. And I've heard Christopher Nolan talk about that as the Joker in Batman. So like that idea, it was really powerful, and I thought really cool. I love that idea.
No, like same. When I was even watching, I was learning more things about these figures. Oh, this is so like knowledgeable. I loved it, and I'm so like scary when it comes to horror. But I think that it did a really great job, and I'm so grateful that you were able to sit down with me today. I'm
Sure.
Corey Nicole again, and I'm with James Buddy Day, and I'm just so glad that you produced this, and I'm just really excited to see how fans react.
Thank you. It was great to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Better shake your booties for black girl nerves. Better shake your booties for black girl nerves.